The air inside Thorne's lab hung thick and acrid, a cocktail of burnt polymers, ozone, and something else, something metallic and faintly organic that clawed at the back of my throat. I stepped over a tangle of severed cables, their insulation melted into grotesque, blackened sculptures. The yellow tape stretched taut across the entry, a flimsy barrier against the chaos that lay beyond. My eyes, accustomed to the aftermath of disaster, still registered the sheer scale of the devastation. This wasn't just a spill, it was an implosion. "Reid, glad you're here." The lead detective, a man whose face was a roadmap of late nights, gestured vaguely at the wreckage. "Looks like a bad one. Pressure vessel rupture, maybe. Or a containment breach." The bioengineer, Thorne, was working on something big, apparently. Experimental stuff. I nodded, my gaze already sweeping past the obvious. The lab was a cavernous space, or what remained of it. Steel benches were warped like taffy, their surfaces blistered and flaking. The ceiling, once a grid of pristine acoustic tiles, sagged in places, revealing scorched structural beams. A fine, gray dust coated everything, a testament to the sheer force unleashed here. This wasn't a fire, not in the traditional sense. This was an explosion that burned from the inside out. "Any initial findings?" I asked, pulling on a pair of fresh nitrile gloves. The crunch of shattered glass under my boots was a constant, unsettling accompaniment. Preliminary assessment from the fire marshal points to a catastrophic failure of his primary bioreactor, the detective explained, consulting a notepad. High-pressure system, volatile reagents. Looks like he made a miscalculation, or... Well, the other theory is he ended it. His research was apparently hitting some walls, financially and scientifically. Pressure mounts, you know? I hummed non-committally. Suicide by scientific implosion wasn't unheard of, but it always left a specific signature. A deliberate act of self-destruction often involved a single, fatal trigger. This scene felt broader, too indiscriminate for a focused exit. My eyes narrowed, tracing the path of destruction. The primary bioreactor, a hulking stainless steel cylinder, was indeed breached, its thick walls peeled back like a flower in reverse bloom. But the damage wasn't uniform. The epicenter seemed to be closer to Thorne's workstation, a section now utterly obliterated. I moved carefully, my boots finding purchase on less unstable ground. The air crackled faintly, even now. "Where's Thorne?" I asked, my voice low. The detective pointed to a section near what used to be a reinforced observation window, now a spider web of cracks. "Over there." The blast threw him clear. Not much left to identify without dental records. I approached the remains, my stomach tightening. The sheer force had been unimaginable. I knelt, examining the fragments of what was once a human being. The heat had been intense, charring tissues beyond recognition. But something snagged my attention, a flicker of discord in the symphony of destruction. On a sliver of the remaining floor, directly adjacent to where Thorne's body had come to rest, I noticed it. A peculiar burn pattern. Not the generalized scorching from the wider explosion, but a localized, almost surgical charring. It was small, no bigger than my thumbnail, and its edges were unusually crisp, almost etched into the concrete. It looked like something had been placed there, something that burned intensely hot, but for a very short duration, and then vanished. I pulled a small magnifying glass from my kit, bringing it closer. The pattern wasn't merely a burn, it had a distinct, almost crystalline texture within the blackened outline. And at its very center, a minuscule, iridescent speck. It glimmered faintly, catching the ambient light filtering through the grimy overhead vents. Too small to be shrapnel, too distinct to be dust. It looked utterly out of place amidst the gray ash and pulverized debris. "What is it, Reid?" the detective asked, seeing my focus. "Intensity." "I don't know yet," I murmured, my mind racing. This wasn't consistent with a spontaneous bioreactor failure. A pressure vessel rupture would create a more diffuse heat signature, a broader cone of effect. And a suicide involving a self-triggered explosion would likely have the trigger mechanism near the victim, not an isolated, precise burn next to where he landed. This tiny detail, this glittering speck, argued against accident. It argued against suicide. It suggested precision, a focused energy release separate from the main event, yet intimately connected to the final moments. Someone had introduced something to this scene, something designed to leave minimal trace, but I was seeing it. I carefully used a fine-tipped forceps to retrieve the speck, depositing it into a sterile evidence file. Then, using a specialized swab, I collected samples from the edges of the peculiar burn pattern, ensuring not to contaminate the site. This wasn't just a miscalculation. This was deliberate. And the person who did this was very, very good at covering their tracks. "We need a full spectral analysis on this floor fragment," I stated, my voice firm. "And I want a complete inventory of Thorne's research materials. Everything that was supposed to be in this lab. Everything that isn't." The detective looked at me, a flicker of surprise in his weary eyes. "You think it's not an accident?" "I think," I replied, standing slowly, the weight of the investigation already settling on my shoulders, "that someone went to a lot of trouble to make it look like one." The tension in the room, already thick with the smell of ruin, tightened further. My gut clenched. This was just the beginning. The samples I'd collected, along with countless others from this shattered space, would eventually make their way to the police department basement holding forensic samples, but the real answers wouldn't be found in a tube or a tray. They were hidden in the gaps, in the things that didn't quite fit. And I would find them. Misery twinged. I moved closer to what remained of Thorne's main workstation, careful not to disturb anything. The console was a melted sculpture of plastic and wires, but beneath its ruin, a faint, almost imperceptible detail snagged my attention. A scorch mark on the reinforced floor, no larger than my thumb, stood out against the broader charring. It was a perfect, almost geometric circle, darker, more intense than the surrounding damage, as if a pinpoint of extreme heat had been applied before the general conflagration. It didn't fit the narrative of a chaotic explosion. Explosions were messy, unpredictable. This mark suggested precision, control. It was a whisper of intent and a scream of destruction, and I already knew this case was going to be anything but simple. The preliminary autopsy report, delivered by the medical examiner in her perpetually cool office in the police department basement holding forensic samples, only deepened my skepticism. "No defensive wounds, Reid," he reported, his voice dry as he flipped through the digital images. "But the thermal damage. It's peculiar. The core temperature sustained by the body suggests a much higher, more focused energy release than the general lab temperature would indicate for the duration. She pointed to a detailed scan. See here? Localized tissue necrosis, almost surgical in its precision, despite the overall widespread trauma. It's like he was hit directly by something incredibly hot, something contained, before the lab itself went up. So, not just a bystander to a general explosion? I asked, leaning forward. No. He was the focal point, or at least, a highly targeted element within the event. And there's this. She pushed a small, clear evidence bag across the table. Inside, nestled against a sterile cotton swab, was the acrid scent of burnt polymers, and something indefinably organic still clung to my clothes, a phantom reminder of the scene. Back at the station, the fluorescent hum of the main corridor felt jarringly sterile. After the muted chaos of Thorne's ruined lab, my gut still churned with the unease that had settled in the moment I first saw the intricate damage. Someone went to a lot of trouble to make it look like one, I'd said, and the words echoed in my mind. My first stop was the police department basement holding forensic samples. The air down here was thick with the faint, metallic tang of processed evidence and the chill of controlled storage. Rows of stainless steel lockers lined the walls, each one a sealed testament to a past investigation. I found the evidence technician already at a long, steel workbench, meticulously cataloging the smaller items recovered from the lab. He was a quiet man, his gloved hands moving with practiced precision over the charred remains of a data drive. Anything from the primary server, or what's left of it? I asked, my voice low. The technician glanced up, his brow furrowed. The heat damage was extensive, Reid. Most of the physical drives are slag. We managed to salvage a few peripheral storage units, heavily encrypted. My team is working on them now, but it's slow going. Anything that survived the blast was designed to be unreadable without specific keys. I nodded, peering at a small, warped piece of circuit board under his magnifying lamp. And the lab's network logs? Any off-site backups? We're pulling what we can from the cloud servers Thorne's company used. Initial reports indicate heavy traffic in the hours leading up to the incident. Not unusual for a research facility, but the timing is interesting. He pushed a small, clear bag across the bench. Inside, a shard of what looked like a specialized memory chip glinted. This was found near the central console. Doesn't match any standard components we've identified from the lab equipment. My fingers tingled as I picked up the bag, feeling the sharp edges of the chip through the plastic. It was tiny, no bigger than a fingernail, but its surface bore a strange, almost organic pattern, unlike the clean lines of typical silicon. A specific detail, perhaps insignificant, perhaps everything. I tucked it into my evidence pouch. Keep me updated on those drives. Prioritize anything related to project files. My next move was to get a clearer picture of Thorne himself. I needed to speak with his assistant. The lead detective, a pragmatic woman with tired eyes, had already arranged it. I found the assistant in a small, temporary office upstairs, clutching a mug of lukewarm coffee. Her name was Maya, and her face was pale, her eyes hollow with a grief that seemed less about loss and more about fear. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. Maya, I began, taking the seat opposite him, I'm Reid. I'm investigating Dr. Thorne's lab. She flinched at the name. It was terrible. He was brilliant, you know. Advanced genetic sequencing? She nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on her trembling hands. Yes. Something. That could change everything. Global health. Or. She shivered, pulling her sweater tighter. He was so careful. Paranoid, almost. In the last few weeks, he'd started talking about unseen eyes. He was convinced someone was trying to get into his systems, trying to steal his work. He'd spend all night, every night, reinforcing the firewalls, changing passwords, disconnecting from the main network at odd hours. Did he ever mention who these unseen eyes might belong to? She shook her head, tears welling. No. Just. They. He said they were everywhere. He even started encrypting his personal notes, things he'd never done before. He said if anything happened to him, his work had to be protected. That it was too dangerous to fall into the wrong hands. Her eyes darted around the office, as if expecting them to appear. He was talking about wiping certain project files, just in case. But he hadn't done it yet, had he? Not before. Thank you, Maya. This is helpful. I stood, leaving her with her coffee and her ghosts. Her words about Thorne's paranoia, about unseen eyes and the need to wipe files, resonated with the technician's report of heavy traffic and unreadable drives. Back in the digital forensics lab, a colleague, a young specialist named Chen, beckoned me over to a bank of glowing monitors. He was tapping rapidly on a keyboard, his expression grim. Reid, you're not going to believe this, Chen said, pointing to a complex log display. We cracked one of the peripheral storage units. Thorne's main project files are intact, mostly. But look at this. He highlighted a section of code. In the 72 hours before the incident, there were multiple, highly sophisticated attempts to access Thorne's core research data. Not just probes, but sustained, targeted attacks. And not from outside the network. My eyes narrowed. Internal? Yes. Someone with high-level credentials, or someone who bypassed them entirely, was inside. And then, Chen scrolled further down, look here. Just 12 hours before the explosion, there's evidence of a partial data wipe. Not a full deletion, but a specific, surgical removal of sub-project files relating to. Well, it looks like a particular gene sequence. And the audit trail for that wipe? It's been completely erased. Thorne's paranoia. Maya's fear. The unseen eyes. This wasn't a tragic accident. It wasn't even a simple murder. This was a deliberate, calculated act, and the killer had gone to extraordinary lengths to hide their tracks, not just of the crime, but of what they were after. The chip in my pocket felt heavier. And they were inside. This was far from over. The lingering image of Thorne's frantic notes, unseen eyes, still scratched at the back of my mind. Maya, the research assistant, had been terrified, her words heavy with unspoken dread. It wasn't just a tragic accident, not even a simple murder. This felt orchestrated, a meticulous dismantling of a life and a project, with the killer moving through the intricate pathways of Thorne's world as if it were their own. They hadn't just hidden their tracks, they'd erased the very reason for their presence. I needed clarity, a definitive anchor in the shifting sands of suspicion. The microscopic trace, the unusual burn pattern, these were my threads. I packed the samples carefully, the tiny fragments of the lab's ruined floor, the scorched console, the almost invisible residue from Thorne's workstation. Each piece, no larger than a grain of sand, held the potential to unravel the killer's narrative. My destination was the police department basement holding forensic samples, a place where the air always hummed with the quiet thrum of specialized equipment and the ghosts of unsolved cases. Fluorescent lights cast a harsh, unwavering glow on rows of metal cabinets and the polished surfaces of analytical instruments. The silence here was a different kind of oppressive than Thorne's lab. It was expectant, waiting for revelations. I set up my workstation, carefully placing the samples under the high-resolution spectral analyzer. Its intricate lenses and optical fibers hummed to life, bathing the microscopic fleck in a focused beam of light. I watched the monitor, a kaleidoscope of data points and spectral lines beginning to paint a complex, unique fingerprint. Each peak and trough represented an element, a compound, a story told in wavelengths. Hours blurred. I meticulously cross-referenced the unique spectral signature against known databases, common lab materials, industrial solvents, biological agents. Nothing matched. The signature was distinct, a series of sharp, unusual peaks that defied easy categorization. My brow furrowed. This wasn't incidental contamination. This was deliberate. I broadened my search, delving into more obscure archives, specialized materials, advanced polymers. The hum of the machine was the only sound in the sterile room, a counterpoint to the racing thoughts in my head. Then, a flicker on the screen, a partial match. I refined the parameters, adjusted the filters, and watched as the system narrowed down the possibilities. A rare, synthetic polymer. The name flashed on the screen, unfamiliar to me in the context of a biological research lab. It was a material engineered for extreme durability and specific thermal resistance, typically used in high-end industrial applications, aerospace components, specialized electronics, advanced manufacturing. Its presence here, in Thorne's biological research facility, was a glaring anomaly. It wasn't something you'd find in a beaker or a petri dish. It was a material designed to withstand environments far more hostile than a controlled laboratory. My mind immediately pivoted. This wasn't about a disgruntled colleague or an academic rival stealing research notes. This polymer, with its very specific industrial lineage, screamed corporate involvement. Thorne's research, potentially world-changing, as the initial reports described it, suddenly seemed less about biology and more about its industrial application. And the primary corporate entity funding Thorne's work, the one with a history of aggressive R&D acquisitions and a reputation for ruthless efficiency, was Omnicorp. I spent another hour solidifying my findings, generating reports, and compiling the evidence. The spectral analysis was irrefutable. I knew my next move. The detective on the case, a man named Miller with tired eyes and a perpetually worried frown, listened intently as I laid out my findings. He nodded, his expression shifting from skepticism to a grim understanding. Omnicorp, he mused, tapping a pen against his chin. They've got their fingers in everything. Getting them to talk will be like pulling teeth. Or like getting them to talk too much, I countered. Already anticipating the corporate dance. I want to speak to their liaison, the one who oversaw their investment in Thorne's project. The meeting was arranged for the following afternoon in a sterile, impersonal conference room at Omnicorp's downtown offices. The room was all glass and polished chrome, a deliberate display of corporate power and transparency that felt utterly opaque. The liaison arrived promptly, a woman named Miss Davies, her smile too wide, her handshake too firm. He was impeccably dressed, his movements precise, almost rehearsed. "Reid," he greeted, his voice smooth and modulated. "Thank you for coming. We're eager to assist in any way we can with this tragic incident involving Dr. Thorne." "Miss Davies," I began, my tone even, "my investigation has led me to a unique material found at the scene. A synthetic polymer, specifically designed for industrial applications. It's not something typically found in a biological research lab." Her smile didn't falter, but a micro-expression, a brief tightening around her eyes, didn't escape my notice. "Ah, yes. Omnicorp funds a vast array of research, Mr. Reid. Dr. Thorne's work, while primarily biological, certainly had potential industrial implications. We often provide specialized materials to our funded researchers, depending on their needs. Do you recognize this specific polymer?" I pushed, showing her a printout of the spectral signature and a basic molecular diagram. "It's a rare composition. Our records indicate Omnicorp holds exclusive manufacturing rights." She examined the printout, her gaze lingering a fraction too long. "It's certainly possible we supplied something similar. Our materials division is extensive." Thorne was exploring some truly cutting-edge applications, some of which required novel containment or structural elements. We'd have to cross-reference our internal supply logs, of course. She paused, her smile returning, even brighter. "We'd be happy to provide those. Anything to help." Her eagerness was almost performative. "Did Dr. Thorne specifically request this polymer?" I asked, watching her closely. "Or was it part of a standard supply package?" "I couldn't say definitively without checking the records," she replied, her gaze flitting to the wall of windows overlooking the city. "My role was primarily oversight, managing the broader financial and strategic aspects of our investment. The specifics of laboratory supplies would fall under our R&D procurement department. But rest assured, we will cooperate fully. Thorne's security protocols were quite stringent, as you know. We had a few engineers who would visit periodically to assess equipment integration or discuss potential scaling, always with prior arrangement and under Dr. Thorne's supervision. And the specific polymer, this industrial-grade material, would it have been used in any of the equipment Omnicorp provided or helped integrate?" She considered this, a delicate finger tapping her chin. "Again, I'd need to consult the technical specifications. It's not my area of expertise, I'm afraid. But if it was, it would have been for a very specific, structural purpose. Something robust." She leaned forward, her voice dropping slightly, as if sharing a confidence. "Honestly, Mr. Reid, we were as shocked as anyone by Dr. Thorne's death. He was a genius. His work was poised to revolutionize, well, many things. It's a tremendous loss for Omnicorp." Her overly cooperative demeanor, the immediate offer of full transparency before I even asked, the convenient lack of specific knowledge, it all coalesced into a dissonant chord. This wasn't a lament for a fallen colleague, it was a carefully managed damage control operation. The unseen eyes Thorne feared weren't just watching, they were actively involved, and Omnicorp was at the center of their gaze. "Work, we finally breached the core server. What we found was a labyrinth of files, most heavily encrypted, detailing Thorne's advanced genetic sequencing research. It wasn't just about global health, as Maya had vaguely suggested. There were deeper implications, pathways that branched into bioweaponry, into what seemed to be a radical redefinition of human identity at a cellular level. It was world-changing, terrifying work. "Look at this," the specialist announced, pointing to a series of timestamps. "Someone was in here recently. Not just browsing, but actively manipulating data. And then, an attempted wipe." The log showed a sophisticated intrusion, not a brute force attack, but a surgical removal of specific project files, followed by an attempt to erase the entire trace of the activity. It was almost successful, but Thorne's system, designed for extreme redundancy, had retained ghost files, digital shadows of what had been there. The intruder had possessed an intimate knowledge of Thorne's system architecture, almost as if they had built it themselves, or had been granted the keys. I revisited Maya, finding her even more withdrawn, almost haunted. We met in a small, sterile interview room in the precinct. The fluorescent lights hummed, amplifying the tension between us. "Maya," I began, my voice low, "we found evidence of data manipulation in Dr. Thorne's lab. An attempted wipe of his research files." "Did you know anything about that?" She wrung her hands, her eyes fixed on the tabletop. "He was so secretive, Reid. Especially about Project Chimera." "Chimera?" I prompted. "That's what he called it. The core of his work. He said it would change everything. But he also said they were trying to steal it. That they wanted to control identity itself." Her voice was barely audible. "He started changing his passwords daily, installing new security. He even talked about replacing his own identity, creating a new digital footprint, a ghost in the machine." "Who were they, Maya?" She shivered. "He never said. Just them. He became convinced someone was inside his network, watching him. He even thought someone was physically entering the lab after hours, though the security logs never showed it. He said he saw a shadow, a fleeting reflection in a polished surface, but dismissed it as exhaustion. He was so paranoid, Reid, it was hard to tell what was real and what was his mind playing tricks him. Words, unsettling as they were, painted a clearer picture of Thorne's final days, a man under extreme pressure, not just from his groundbreaking work, but from an unseen adversary. Adversary with the skill to bypass his digital defenses and perhaps even his physical ones. Back in the police department basement, the spectral analysis of the microscopic speck found on Thorne's arm finally yielded its secrets. The forensic specialist, a meticulous man named David, called me over to his workstation. "Reid, you're not going to believe this," he said, his voice a mix of awe and bewilderment. He zoomed in on the image on his screen, a highly magnified, iridescent shard, its surface shimmering with complex molecular bonds. "It's a synthetic polymer. Extremely rare. We've cross-referenced it with every known database, and it's a proprietary material. Used in high-end industrial applications, specifically for ultra-durable, heat-resistant coatings on specialized machinery. Think aerospace, deep-sea drilling, or highly advanced biocontainment systems." "Any manufacturers?" I asked, my mind already racing. "Only one known to produce this exact variant, Omnicorp. They hold the patent. It's their signature polymer. The corporate representative's carefully constructed performance still grated on me, a low-frequency hum of discord in my mind. Her immediate offer of full transparency, the convenient amnesia regarding specifics, the almost rehearsed lament for Thorne, it all reeked of something far more calculated than grief. And then there was the polymer. The initial analysis, rushed as it was, suggested a compound that wasn't quite right. It wasn't just a variant of Thorne's patented material, it was incomplete, almost deliberately destabilized. It wasn't meant to hold, not long-term. I needed to dig deeper, away from the polished surfaces of corporate offices and into the gritty reality of raw data. My instincts screamed that the elaborate staging of Thorne's death wasn't just about stealing his research, it was about silencing him, preventing something far more significant from coming to light. A simple theft would have been crude, less intricate. This killer had gone to extraordinary lengths, meticulously crafting an accident, suggesting a motive that transcended mere acquisition. They wanted to bury something. I found myself in the police department basement holding forensic samples, a cavernous space where the air hung heavy with the faint, metallic tang of sterile cleaning agents and the quiet hum of servers. Fluorescent lights cast a pallid glow over rows of shelving units, each holding evidence bagged and tagged with meticulous precision. Thorne's workstation, a high-end custom build, sat on a steel table, its internal drives already mirrored and accessible. The digital forensics specialist, a younger officer with an uncanny knack for unearthing buried data, was already at work, his fingers flying across a keyboard. "Anything new, officer?" I asked, leaning over his shoulder, my eyes scanning the lines of code scrolling across his monitor. He shook his head, not looking up. "Clean, on the surface. Standard operating system, research files neatly categorized, backups present. No obvious deletions or attempts to wipe data from the main directories. Almost too perfect, if you ask me." "My thoughts exactly," I murmured, running a hand over my jaw. Thorne was meticulous, but also a pragmatist. He wouldn't have kept everything in plain sight, especially if he suspected trouble. I pulled up a chair beside him. "Let's assume this isn't about stealing the product of his research, but about preventing its release. Or, more specifically, preventing him from releasing something else entirely. Look for anything out of place. Hidden partitions, unusual file sizes, encrypted containers that don't link to the main project files." The specialist nodded, his brow furrowed in concentration. We spent the next 2 hours in a silent, methodical hunt. He ran advanced sector-by-sector scans, looking for anomalies in the file system, while I reviewed the metadata of every seemingly innocuous document. The official research logs, the ones the corporate representative had been so eager to provide, were extensive but strangely sterile. They detailed the technical progress, the challenges, the breakthroughs, but offered no personal insights, no ethical musings that I knew Thorne, a man of deep conviction, would undoubtedly have. Then, a small flicker. Deep within a nested directory, disguised as a system recovery file, the specialist found it. A file with an unusual extension, a size that didn't quite fit its supposed function. "Got something, Reid," he said, his voice tight with discovery. "Heavy encryption. Military grade, by the looks of it. Not linked to any of his project keys." My pulse quickened. This was it. This was the hidden compartment, the secret vault Thorne had built to protect his true thoughts. "Can you crack it?" He typed furiously, running a series of algorithms. The progress bar crept along, agonizingly slow. The tension in the basement thickened, a palpable weight. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a cascade of plain text filled the screen. The entries were dated, personal, written in a tone far removed from the detached scientific prose of his official logs. Thorne's voice, raw and urgent, filled the screen. Entry 17, the implications of the polymer. They are profound, beyond anything I initially conceived. Omnicorp's interest has shifted. They are not merely funding the synthesis, they are driving its application towards a purpose I cannot sanction. The data I'm seeing from their secondary project. It's horrifying. They're weaponizing the very principle of molecular destabilization, not for material science, but for targeted biological degradation. They want to turn it into a silent, untraceable agent. I leaned closer, my eyes devouring the text. Biological degradation. This wasn't about a stronger material, it was about something that could dismantle life itself. Entry 23, I've gathered enough proof. Omnicorp has been clandestinely funding a separate, black box initiative, leveraging my core research for a weapon. That accidents reported at their remote testing facilities, they're not accidents. I tried to confront the director, the corporate representative. She dismissed my concerns, threatened my funding, my reputation. They are too entrenched. I cannot allow this to continue. My gaze snapped to the next entry. Entry 25, I am preparing to go public. I have secured the evidence, encrypted and hidden. If anything happens to me, this information must be released. The world needs to know what Omnicorp is truly building. They will stop at nothing to prevent this. I fear my time is running short. The last entry was dated 3 days before his death. My breath hitched. It wasn't just the polymer. It wasn't just about the threat of his research being stolen or misused. Thorne was a whistleblower, poised to expose a far more sinister project, a weapon of unimaginable destructive potential, funded by the very corporation that now controlled the narrative of his death. The corporate representative hadn't been managing damage control, she'd been managing a cover-up. The killer hadn't wanted Thorne's work, they wanted his silence. And now, they had it. But they hadn't accounted for Thorne's foresight, or mine. The stakes had just escalated beyond anything I could have imagined. I wasn't just investigating a murder, I was standing on the precipice of exposing a global threat, and the people behind it had already proven they would kill to keep their secrets buried. Forward, his voice dropping slightly. Omnicorp has been fully cooperative, offering all assistance. We've even offered to provide our own internal investigators to help with the cleanup. We want answers as much as you do. His overly cooperative demeanor, the eagerness to offer assistance, the subtle redirecting of responsibility, it all felt like a carefully rehearsed performance. He wasn't just a liaison, he was a gatekeeper, protecting Omnicorp's interests, and possibly, its secrets. The polymer was a direct link, but Davies was doing his best to make it seem innocuous, a mere byproduct of their generous support. But accidents started subtly, a creeping unease that quickly escalated into undeniable threats. I was leaving the precinct one evening, my mind still replaying Davies's evasive answers, when a black sedan, appearing from nowhere, swerved violently towards me at an intersection. The screech of tires, the blare of the horn, the rush of wind as it narrowly missed me, it was too close, too deliberate to be random. I felt the chilling certainty that I was no longer just investigating, I was being warned. The next incident was more personal. I returned to my personal lab, a small, cluttered space in the police department basement where I often process sensitive samples away from prying eyes, to find a precise, almost surgical disruption. Nothing was stolen, nothing overtly damaged. But my microscope was slightly off-kilter, a sterile swab had been moved from its designated tray, and a faint, almost metallic scent lingered in the air, something I couldn't immediately identify, but knew wasn't usually present. It was a message, "We know where you work. We can get to you." The threat solidified my resolve. Someone was actively trying to impede confrontation_and_confession. The air in the police department basement holding forensic samples was perpetually cool, a sterile hush broken only by the hum of ventilation systems and the distant clatter from the floors above. It was late, past midnight, when I sealed the last container. On the label, a false lead, Polymer 7X, phase stabilization breakthrough. I'd made sure the details looked convincing, a hastily scrawled note hinting at a sudden advancement in Thorne's volatile compound. The kind of advancement that would make its weaponized application terrifyingly feasible. I knew the victim's brother, David Thorne, was still around, still asking questions, still too interested in the specific nuances of his brother's work. He'd been feeding me carefully curated information, always steering me away from the true nature of Eris's final project, always subtly guiding me towards the accident narrative. He was a spider, spinning his web, but I'd finally found the thread that led back to him. I left the container prominently displayed on a cart near the entrance to the secured area, a deliberate vulnerability. Then I retreated, melting into the shadows between the towering shelves of evidence lockers. My breath was shallow, my senses sharpened by the anticipation. This was it. The trap was set. Time stretched, a taut wire. Minutes crawled into what felt like an hour. I listened to the rhythmic thrum of the building, the faint echoes of the city filtering through the thick concrete walls. Then, a soft click. The heavy door to the basement level eased open. A figure slipped inside, moving with a practiced silence that spoke volumes. It was the victim's brother. He moved quickly, his gaze sweeping the room before settling on the cart. I watched him approach, his silhouette stark against the dim emergency lighting. His hands, usually so steady when he'd poured me coffee in his brother's pristine lab, now trembled slightly as he reached for the container. He opened it, his fingers fumbling with the seal, and pulled out the fabricated report. I saw his head tilt, his eyes scanning the lines I'd meticulously crafted. A flicker of panic crossed his face. He'd taken the bait. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a small, metallic device. Not a weapon, but something more insidious, a data scrambler, designed to corrupt the very data I was pretending to have. He froze, the device clattering to the floor. A lure. And you swallowed it whole. He took a step back, his hand instinctively going for the door handle. I don't know what you're talking about. I was just checking on my brother's samples. Concern for his legacy, you understand. Legacy? Or liability? I stopped a few feet from him, letting my gaze bore into his. You've been trying to cover his tracks since the beginning. Misdirection, carefully planted half-truths. But you made a mistake, David. What are you implying? The polymer, David. The unique, highly volatile polymer Eris was working with. I pointed to the container on the cart. You handled it. Not just in Eris's lab, but elsewhere. Traces of it were found at my apartment, after that gas leak. And again, near the broken railing at the observation deck. Accidents, you called them. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He knew. He knew I had him. We found microscopic traces of the exact same polymer, the one Eris was developing, on the sole of your shoe. When you came in for questioning, I continued, pressing my advantage. The same polymer that was found under Eris's fingernails, consistent with a struggle, not an accident. And, more damningly, embedded in the scorched fabric of his lab coat, just before the explosion. It wasn't a lab accident, David. It was murder. His composure shattered. He slumped against the wall, his eyes fixed on some point beyond me, lost in a grim memory. He was going to ruin everything, he rasped, his voice barely audible. He was going to expose them. Expose who? I demanded, leaning in. He looked up, a raw, desperate pain in his eyes. Omnicorp. Not the whole company, but a faction. They were funding Eris's real work. The weapon. He thought he could control it, perfect it. But when he realized what they truly intended, how they would use it, he couldn't stand it. He was going to blow the whistle. Expose their bioweapon development to the world. My mind raced, connecting the dots. The unimaginable destructive potential Eris had hinted at in his journal, the sinister project. It wasn't just about the polymer, it was about its application. They tasked you with neutralizing him, I stated, not a question. He nodded slowly, tears welling in his eyes. They said it was for the greater good. To prevent global chaos. He was too close. Too principled. He would have destroyed years of research, countless lives. And my own future. They promised me a position. Influence. If I could just handle Eris. He swallowed hard, his voice thick with a confession that had been festering for weeks. I didn't want to. But he wouldn't listen. He wouldn't stop, so I. The scent. My mind immediately connected it to the faint odor in my own lab, the one I couldn't identify. It was a signature, a calling card. Maya's confession was the missing piece. Someone had been in the lab, intimately familiar with its systems, skilled enough to bypass security and move unnoticed. And they carried a distinctive scent, a subtle identifier. The final phase of the investigation brought me back to the devastation of Thorne's lab, this time with a team of digital forensics experts and structural engineers. We meticulously reconstructed the scene, both physically and digitally, sifting through every fragment of data, every scorch mark, every twisted piece of metal. The police department basement had become a repository of Thorne's life and death, an archive of the catastrophe. The digital forensics team worked tirelessly on the remnants of the lab's extensive security and environmental control systems. Thorne's paranoia had inadvertently preserved the truth. His systems, designed for absolute control, logged everything, even the subtle manipulations of an expert intruder. Reid, look at this, the lead digital forensics specialist called out, his voice tight with discovery. He displayed a complex timeline on a large monitor. About an hour before the primary explosion, there was a series of microfluctuations in the atmospheric controls. A precise, programmed alteration of the oxygen-nitrogen balance, followed by a spike in a specific catalytic agent within the ventilation system. Then, a few minutes later, a localized energy surge in a specific workstation, not Thorne's, but one adjacent to it, where he kept his most volatile reagents. A multi-stage manipulation, I murmured, watching the data unfold. Exactly, he confirmed. It wasn't a random malfunction. It was a precisely orchestrated sequence. The atmospheric change created an environment primed for extreme combustion. The catalytic agent lowered the ignition threshold. The energy surge in the adjacent workstation was the spark, timed perfectly to ignite the volatile reagents, not in Thorne's main area. Near it, creating a directed blast. The structural engineers, cross-referencing this data with the physical damage, pointed to the geometric scorch mark I had noticed on my first visit. That mark, Reid, one of them explained, it's consistent with the point of initial, superheated impact. The energy surge was channeled, focused, hitting that precise spot first, creating a flashpoint for the larger conflagration. It was designed to look like a spontaneous, chaotic explosion, but the initial trigger was pinpoint accurate. The picture snapped into terrifying clarity. That accident was a sophisticated, multi-stage act of murder. The killer hadn't just blown up a lab, they had engineered a fatal event that mimicked a research malfunction, triggered remotely, designed to eliminate Thorne and destroy his critical research. The method pointed to someone with an expert, almost intimate, knowledge of Thorne's specific protocols, his bespoke lab systems, and the volatile nature of his Project Chimera. The culprit had understood Thorne's work better than anyone, perhaps even better than Thorne himself. They knew the precise vulnerabilities, the exact sequence of events that would create a devastating, yet perfectly deniable, catastrophe. The rare synthetic polymer, the distinct scent, the digital manipulation, the engineered blast, all pieces of a meticulously crafted puzzle. I had the how, the what, and the why. Thorne's identity-altering research was either too valuable to be left in his hands, or too dangerous to be allowed to continue. The killer, hidden behind layers of corporate power and carefully orchestrated sabotage, had erased Thorne's identity, alone.